a quiet settlement at the edge of a vast valley, life moved slowly. People there lived simple lives. They farmed the land, built their homes, raised their families. But the world around them was never truly peaceful. The valley could be beautiful one moment and dangerous the next. Sudden storms could sweep across the land without warning. Wild creatures wandered too close to the settlement walls, and conflicts with nearby groups sometimes turned violent. Because of this, the people relied on something more than tools. They relied on their armor. The suits were not just pieces of metal and machinery. They were protection. They were hope. They were the reason ordinary people could stand against dangers much larger than themselves. Every generation had its guardians. Every guardian had carried the armor when the settlement needed them most. But among all the suits, one was remembered above the rest. The Old Guardian, a legendary suit that had protected the settlement for decades. It had been passed from one protector to another, father to daughter, teacher to student, hero to hero. Stories were told about it around evening fires, how it had stood against impossible storms, how it had saved families from creatures that should have been unstoppable, how its wearer always returned home. The people respected the armor, almost like it had a spirit of its own. But time was stronger than any legend. The years had left their marks. The once shining plates were now covered in scratches and cracks. Deep fractures ran across the armor's surface. The powerful inner systems that once moved with perfect precision now struggled with every step. The energy core flickered. The mechanical joints groaned. Pieces that had survived countless battles were finally beginning to fail. The younger people of the settlement whispered that it was time to replace it. Old things should be forgotten, some said. New machines are stronger. But the oldest protectors disagreed, because they knew something others did not. The armor was never special because of its metal. It was special because of everyone who had stood inside it. Every scar on the surface carried a story. Every repair showed that someone had refused to give up. And now, for the first time in many years, the Old Guardian needed someone new. Someone willing to wear a broken legend. Someone willing to believe that even damaged things could still protect others. And far away from the settlement, a young mechanic was about to discover that the greatest strength of the armor was not hidden in its systems. It was hidden in its history. The armor that once inspired hope now stood broken, leaning against a wall in silence. The woman who had worn it last looked at it with sadness. She remembered the times it had saved her, the times she had stood tall in battles and returned safely only because of the strength of that suit. Now seeing it broken felt like losing an old companion. She asked many workers in the settlement to repair it. There were metal workers, blacksmiths, and even travelers from other places who claimed to have skill. Each of them tried. Some replaced parts, others hammered the plates back into place, and a few even said it was better to melt it down and build a new one. But no matter what they tried, the armor never regained its strength. It was heavy, stiff, and unable to move as it once did. The woman felt hopeless. She began to believe that maybe the armor's time had ended, that it had given all it could. People around her also accepted this thought. They said, "Nothing lasts forever. Let it rest." But deep inside, she did not want to give up. The armor was more than metal to her. It carried memories, victories, and the trust of the people. She wanted it to live again. One day, while the broken armor stood in the workshop for yet another attempt at repair, a man walked in. He was not known as a fighter, or even as someone with great physical strength. Instead, people knew him as a human engineer. He spent most of his time studying machines, fixing tools, and building things that made life easier. He was quiet, often keeping to himself, and rarely drew attention. To many, he seemed ordinary, someone who blended into the background. When he approached the armor, people whispered. Some laughed quietly, saying, "What can he do? He has never even worn armor." Others shook their heads, believing he would waste his time. But the man ignored the voices. He did not see the armor as something to show off strength. He saw it as a puzzle, a story written in metal that needed to be read carefully. He knelt beside it and began to study it closely. He touched the cracks, gently, ran his fingers over the broken edges, and looked deep into the joints where the plates met. He asked questions no one else had asked. When did this piece break? What sound did it make before it failed? Did it feel heavier before it stopped working? His questions surprised the woman. No one had asked her these things before. She answered slowly, recalling her last battles, the moments when she had felt the armor weaken. As she spoke, he listened carefully, his eyes focused, his mind connecting each detail. He did not rush, nor did he dismiss her words. To him, her memories were as important as the broken parts. The crowd that had gathered grew restless. Some rolled their eyes, others left believing nothing would come of this. But the woman stayed. For the first time, she felt that someone was truly trying to understand, not just to fix. The engineer spent hours that day simply observing. He did not take tools immediately, nor did he start hammering or pulling parts apart. Instead, he studied the design, the way the armor had been built long ago, the changes others had made, and the marks of every failed attempt. He noticed things others had missed, tiny scratches that showed strain, hidden joints that had been forced wrongly, and connections that no one had thought to check. When the day ended, the woman expected him to leave, but he stayed late into the night. He lit a small lamp and continued his study. His hands moved slowly, carefully, as if the armor was fragile. He wrote notes in a small book he carried, sketching the parts, making calculations, and planning quietly. The woman watched him and felt something she had not felt in weeks: hope. The next morning, when people returned, they found him still there. His eyes were tired, but his focus had not faded. He began the work patiently. Instead of tearing the armor apart, he disassembled it piece by piece, setting each part aside carefully in a specific order. He cleaned the plates, removed the rust, and uncovered hidden damage. Each small detail mattered to him. When others had worked on the armor, they had been loud, hammering and forcing things into place. But this man worked softly, almost as though he was speaking to the armor with his hands. The woman offered to help, and though he did not speak much, he allowed her to hand him tools to hold the parts he was fixing. Working beside him, she began to see the armor differently. It was not just broken metal, it was like a body that had been hurt and was now being healed. Day by day, the settlement watched. Some still doubted, whispering that he was wasting his time. Others began to grow curious, noticing that the armor was slowly changing. The broken edges were no longer rough. The joints began to move more freely. The weight that had once dragged it down seemed lighter as he replaced damaged parts with care. The woman who had once stood in despair now stood with hope each day, waiting to see what he would do next. The engineer never rushed. He did not promise quick results or boast about his skills. He simply worked with steady patience, believing that even the most broken things could be restored if given enough care. While others saw the armor as a tool or a piece of metal, he treated it as something living, something worth saving. As days turned into weeks, people began to notice not just the changes in the armor, but also in the woman. She no longer looked hopeless. She began to smile when she saw progress, her eyes brighter than before. She realized that repairing the armor was not just about metal. It was about restoring belief, about showing that even when something seemed beyond repair, there could still be a chance. And at the center of it all was the human engineer, quietly working, never asking for praise, never demanding attention. He was simply a man who saw possibility where others saw failure. The woman often wondered why he cared so much, why he was willing to spend so many hours on something that others had already given up on. But each time she thought of asking, she stopped herself. Perhaps his actions spoke louder than any answer he could give. The broken armor was no longer silent. Under his hands, it was slowly coming back to life, and with it, the settlement began to feel something it had not felt in a long time: hope for what lay ahead. The human engineer began his work with the same calm patience he had shown on the first day. From the outside, it looked like he was simply fixing broken metal, but in truth, he was giving every moment of his attention to the smallest details. He treated each piece of the armor as though it held a secret, and with steady hands, he tried to discover what that secret was. Most people in the settlement believed that repairing armor required only strength, hammering dents, melting new plates, and forcing pieces back into place. But the engineer worked differently. He believed strength was nothing without understanding. So instead of rushing, he listened. He listened to the faint sound of the plates when tapped with his tools. He noticed how some pieces rang clear, while others made a dull, heavy sound that showed hidden weakness. He studied the joints as they moved, watching carefully for stiffness or strain. Each night he would stay long after the others had left. The workshop, which was usually noisy during the day, would grow quiet. Only the sound of his tools and the soft scratching of his pencil on paper filled the room. The woman often stayed with him, though she did not speak much. She would sit nearby, sometimes holding a lamp so he could see better, sometimes watching. His hands moved with precision. There was something comforting about the way he worked. Even though the armor was broken, his steady movements made her believe it could be whole again. On the third day, he carefully cleaned the inside of the armor. Dust, old grease, and pieces of rust had collected over the years. Many workers before him had ignored this, focusing only on the outer plates, but he knew that the inside was just as important. He pulled out wires that had been poorly replaced, polished small gears that had been clogged, and adjusted tiny mechanisms that no one else had noticed. The woman watched him closely. "Why are you working on the inside?" she asked softly. No one else ever cared about that. He looked up at her briefly and said in his quiet voice, "Because the inside gives strength to the outside. If the inside is weak, the outside will always fail." His words stayed with her. She realized he was not just talking about the armor, but also about life. The work was not easy. Many times he came across problems that made him stop and think for long stretches of time. A broken joint that did not fit with the others. A plate that had been bent in a way that no hammer could fix. A gear that had been replaced with the wrong size. Each problem would have made another worker give up. But the engineer never grew angry, never showed frustration. He would sit quietly, studying the part, drawing it in his book and testing different ways, until he found a solution. The people of the settlement often came to watch. At first they laughed, calling his work slow. "He will take a lifetime to finish," some said. But as days passed, their laughter grew softer. They began to see changes. The once heavy armor moved a little more smoothly. The broken plates were not just patched, but carefully reshaped to fit together like puzzle pieces. The dull sound of the armor was replaced by a stronger, clearer ring. Children came too, sitting near the door, their eyes wide as they watched him. They were fascinated, not by the armor itself, but by the way he worked. To them he seemed like a magician, turning broken things into something new. The woman noticed the change in the people. Even those who had once mocked him now stood silently watching with respect. It was as if the whole settlement was slowly learning patience from him. One evening, after hours of quiet work, the engineer sat back and sighed. His hands were covered with marks from handling rough metal, and his eyes were tired, but there was a faint smile on his face. The woman brought him a cup of water. "You've been working since morning," she said gently. "Don't you ever rest?" He took the cup, drank slowly, and then replied, "I will rest when it is done. Until then, I must keep going." His words were simple, but they carried weight. The woman realized he was not fixing the armor for fame or reward. He was doing it because he believed in finishing what he started. His quiet determination inspired her, and she found herself waiting each day just to see the progress he made. As the armor slowly came together, she remembered the times she had worn it. She remembered standing tall in battle, hearing the armor shield her from blows, feeling its strength surround her. She remembered how safe she had felt inside it. Seeing it broken had made her feel vulnerable, but watching it being repaired brought back her courage. One night, when the engineer was tightening a joint, she spoke softly. "Do you really think it can be like before? Strong, fast, and ready to protect again?" He paused for a moment, then looked at her with calm eyes. "It will never be exactly the same, but it can be strong in a new way. Sometimes things that are broken, and then repaired, become stronger than they were before." His answer surprised her. She thought about her own life, about the time she had been hurt, and had stood up again. Perhaps he was right. Not just about the armor, but about people too. Word spread across the settlement. People began to visit the workshop, not only to watch, but to offer help. Some brought food, others brought tools, and a few even brought pieces of metal, hoping they might be useful. The engineer accepted their kindness, but continued to work in his steady way, never letting excitement or distraction take his focus away. The woman realized something else about him. He never spoke about himself. He never said where he had learned such skill, or why he cared so much. He spoke only about the work, the process, and the steps needed to bring the armor back. Yet through his actions, she felt she understood him better each day. The armor was now beginning to look alive again. Its joints moved more freely, its plates shone with new light, and its weight felt balanced. Still, the engineer did not rush to declare it finished. He tested every part again and again, making sure no weakness remained. His patience was endless, and the woman admired him for it. By the end of the second week, something had changed, not just in the armor, but in the settlement itself. People began to talk less about failure and more about hope. They stopped saying it cannot be done, and started saying, maybe it can. The engineer had not only repaired the armor, he had begun to repair their faith. The woman often thought about how strange it was. So many skilled workers had tried before and failed. Yet this quiet human engineer, who had never worn armor in battle, was succeeding. Perhaps it was not just skill that made the difference. Perhaps it was the heart he put into his work, the patience that others lacked, and the belief that nothing was beyond saving. Each evening, when the workshop grew quiet, the woman would look at the armor and then at the man who worked on it. She knew that no matter what happened in the days ahead, she would never forget these moments. For in those long hours of steady work, she had seen something greater than metal being repaired. She had seen the power of dedication, the strength of patience, and the courage of someone who never gave up, even when the world around him doubted. And though the armor was not yet complete, she felt certain that when it finally stood whole again, it would carry not just the strength of metal, but the spirit of the man who had restored it piece by piece. The days after the celebration brought a new spirit to the settlement. People walked with lighter steps, their voices brighter than before. The armor now stood ready once again, polished and strong, a symbol of resilience. But more than the armor itself, it was the story behind it that gave people strength. The story of how one quiet man had refused to give up when everyone else had. The woman often stood before the armor, her hand resting gently on its surface. Each time she remembered not only the battles it had seen, but the patient hands that had brought it back to life. It was no longer just a piece of protection to her. It was a reminder of trust, dedication, and unseen courage. The bond between her and the engineer grew quietly, much like the way he worked, without noise, without grand gestures, but with steady strength. They spoke more often now. She would ask him about the machines he worked on, and he would explain in simple words that made her see them differently. He in turn would ask her about her battles, not out of curiosity, but out of a genuine wish to understand her world. Through these conversations, they came to know each other deeply. She saw that he carried wisdom far beyond his years, though he never tried to show it. He saw that beneath her armor and her strength, she carried fears and doubts like anyone else. Together, they found comfort in sharing what others could not see. The settlement also changed. People who once dismissed patience as weakness began to value it. Children who once admired only warriors now looked up to the engineer as well, asking him to teach them about tools, gears, and quiet focus. Farmers asked him to repair their plows, and travelers came seeking his advice. Slowly, respect for builders, thinkers, and healers grew alongside respect for fighters. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, the woman walked with the engineer along a quiet path outside the settlement. The air was cool, and the sky was painted with soft colors. She turned to him and said, "Do you know what you have done? You didn't just fix the armor. You reminded people of something they had forgotten, that strength is not only in battle, but also in care, patience, and thought." He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "I did only what I knew. If they see more in it, then I am glad." She stopped walking and faced him. "No, you must understand. You gave them hope when even I had none. That is not a small thing. That is a gift, greater than you realize." For the first time, he looked slightly moved by her words. He lowered his eyes thoughtfully, and then said quietly, "Perhaps. But if I gave hope, it was only because you believed enough to let me try. You could have turned me away like the others, but you didn't. That trust made everything possible." The woman was silent, touched by his words. She realized that trust had indeed been the bridge between them. Without it, the armor would still be broken, and their bond would never have formed. In the weeks that followed, the armor was used again. She wore it during patrols, protecting the settlement from danger. Each time she moved in it, She remembered his hands shaping it, his patience restoring it. And each time she returned safely, she knew it was not only her strength, but his as well that kept her safe. The people began to call the armor not just a shield, but a symbol of unity. They said it carried both the courage of the warrior and the patience of the engineer. It became a reminder that survival was not the work of one kind of person, but of many fighters, builders, thinkers, and dreamers together. The woman and the engineer often stood together beside the armor, answering people's questions, teaching children, and quietly guiding those who sought advice. Though they were different, one known for battle, the other for building, they shared a bond that no difference could break. In time, the people stopped speaking only of the armor's strength. They began to speak of the bond between the woman and the man, how their trust and understanding had created something greater than either could have done alone. The woman knew the truth of this in her heart. Each time she looked at him, she saw not just the man who had repaired armor, but the man who had reminded her of courage when she thought it was lost. And he, though quiet as always, looked at her with steady eyes that showed respect, trust, and something unspoken, but deeply felt. Together, they carried the lesson that had changed their lives and the lives of the settlement. That true strength is not found only in steel or in power, but in patience, care, and the quiet bond of trust between people. And so the armor stood not just as metal shaped by hands, but as a story, a memory, and a symbol of the lasting bond between a warrior who once lost hope and a human engineer who refused to give up. The day of the test became a turning point for the settlement. Everyone had seen the broken armor restored, moving with strength and smoothness, as if it had never been damaged. The people spoke excitedly about the miracle they had witnessed, but in truth, it was not a miracle. It was the quiet work of a man who had believed when no one else did. The woman could not forget the moment she had stood in the repaired armor, the way the crowd had cheered, and the way her heart had lifted. For weeks, she had lived with despair, thinking the armor's time was over. But now, because of the human engineer, it stood whole again. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with soft colors, the people gathered in the open square of the settlement. They wanted to celebrate, and though the engineer had not asked for it, they spoke loudly of his achievement. Some called him a savior, others a genius. Food was shared, music was played, and laughter filled the air. The woman stood near the center, the armor gleaming beside her. She had been asked to say a few words to the people. Normally, she was not one for speeches. She was a warrior, someone whose actions spoke louder than words. But this moment felt different. She looked at the people gathered, then at the man who stood quietly among them, not seeking attention. Something inside her told her that silence would not be enough this time. She took a deep breath. The crowd grew quiet, waiting for her to speak. Her voice trembled at first, but then it grew stronger. "You all know this armor," she began. "It has protected us for many years. It has faced battles, storms, and dangers that could have destroyed us. But recently, it was broken. Many tried to repair it, and many failed. I began to believe that its time was over, that we would never see it stand strong again." The people nodded. They had all shared in that despair. She continued, her eyes glancing toward the engineer. But one man did not give up. He did not rush. He did not grow angry when the work became hard. He did not listen to the voices that told him it could not be done. Instead, he gave his patience his care and his skill. He listened when no one else listened. He looked where no one else looked. And because of him, the armor is alive again. The crowd broke into cheers, clapping and calling out. But she raised her hand for silence, for she was not finished. Her voice grew steadier, filled with emotion. "Only the human engineer repaired this armor," she said. Her words rang clear, echoing through the square. The people listened, their hearts touched. "Do not forget this. Do not think it was luck or chance. It was his dedication, his belief, and his quiet strength that made it possible. We owe him more than thanks. We owe him our respect." As she spoke those words, she slowly turned her gaze toward him. The crowd followed her eyes, and suddenly all attention was on the engineer. He shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the weight of so many eyes, but he did not look away. The woman's gaze was steady, filled not just with gratitude, but with something deeper, recognition. For a long moment, the square was silent. No music, no chatter, no cheering. Only the connection between the woman and the man spoken without words, but felt by everyone present. It was the moment when people realized that something important had happened, not just to the armor, but to their lives. The engineer lowered his head slightly, as if acknowledging her words, but he said nothing. He did not need to. His work had spoken for him. The celebration continued late into the night, but the woman found herself watching him more than she joined the music or laughter. She saw how he moved quietly, never putting himself in the center, always blending into the background. Yet she also saw how people approached him now with respect, offering him food, thanking him, asking him questions. He responded with humility, speaking only what was needed. When the celebration ended, she approached him as he was preparing to leave. "You never wanted their praise, did you?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "I only wanted the armor to stand again. That was enough." She studied him in silence for a moment, then said, "And yet you did more than that. You gave me back my courage. You gave the people back their hope. That cannot be measured." He looked at her with calm eyes and replied, "Hope is always there. Sometimes it just needs to be reminded." Those words stayed with her, as she watched him walk away into the night. She realized that his gift was not just the armor, it was the way he reminded people of what was possible. From that day onward, she carried his words and his quiet strength in her heart. And though she did not say it aloud, she knew her life had changed forever. The weeks of patient work finally brought the armor close to completion. What had once been broken, heavy, and lifeless, now stood stronger, shining with new strength. The woman looked at it with wonder. She could hardly believe this was the same armor that had been declared beyond repair by so many others. It was not only fixed, but seemed to carry a new energy, as if the hands that had touched it had given it life again. But the true test was yet to come. Repairing something in a workshop was one thing. To know if it could truly protect the armor had to be tested under real conditions. Without this test, no one could say for certain whether it was strong or weak. This thought filled the woman with both hope and fear. She remembered clearly the last time she had worn the armor before it broke. The battle had been long, her enemies many. The armor had protected her until the very end, when one final strike had pushed it beyond its limit. She had barely survived that day, carried back by her companions, while the once strong suit lay, broken around her. The memory still haunted her. To step inside it again, even after repair, meant facing that memory. The engineer, however, was calm. He checked every part, again and again. He tightened the joints, tested the weight, and adjusted the inner supports so they would fit her body perfectly. He said little, but his actions showed his certainty. When the time came, the settlement gathered around. Word had spread, and everyone wanted to see if the armor would truly work again. Some were filled with excitement, while others still carried doubt. "It looks strong," a man whispered. "But will it move?" another said. "What if it breaks again? What if it cannot protect her anymore?" The woman stood silently as she looked at the armor. Her heart beat fast. She wanted to trust the engineer, but the fear of disappointment weighed heavily on her. She thought of asking him again if he was sure, but when she looked at him, she saw no fear in his eyes. He stood quietly, waiting, as if he already knew the answer. Finally, she stepped forward. The crowd grew silent. She touched the armor with her hand, feeling the smooth plates and the steady joints. Slowly, she began to put it on. Piece by piece, it wrapped around her body, fitting more perfectly than she remembered. The inside was no longer rough or stiff. It felt balanced, almost as if it were part of her. The moment she was fully inside the armor, she closed her eyes. For a second, she was afraid to move. What if it failed? What if everyone saw her stumble? But then she remembered the long nights when the engineer had worked without rest, the patience in his hands, and the quiet confidence in his voice. She took a deep breath and took her first step. The sound of the armor moving echoed through the workshop. The crowd leaned forward. Her step was smooth, lighter than before. She took another, and then another. To her surprise, the armor responded easily, almost naturally, as if it were alive again. The weight she once felt dragging her down was gone. Instead, it felt strong, but free, giving her both protection and movement. The people gasped. Some clapped their hands while others stared in disbelief. "It works," someone whispered. "It really works." Encouraged by their reactions, the woman tested it further. She raised her arms, and the armor lifted without stiffness. She bent her knees, and the joints moved smoothly. She even turned quickly, and the suit followed her motion without delay. It was as if the armor had been reborn, but the engineer was not satisfied with simple movements. He stepped forward and spoke quietly. To know its strength, it must face pressure. Try it against resistance. The woman nodded, though a small part of her was still nervous. The settlement quickly arranged a test. They brought wooden poles and heavy stones to strike against the armor. At first the strikes were light, testing its surface. The armor held firm, the sound of wood and stone bouncing off its plates without harm. Then the strikes grew stronger. Still the armor absorbed the blows, its plates holding, its joints unshaken. The woman felt her fear fade. With each strike, she realized the engineer's work had not only repaired the armor, but made it stronger than before. She began to move faster, dodging and blocking, her confidence growing. The people cheered, their voices rising in excitement. For the first time in many months, she felt the same courage she once had when she first wore the armor. Yet this time, it was different. It was not just the armor's strength she trusted. It was the man who had given it new life. When the test ended, she stood tall in the center, the armor shining in the sunlight that streamed through the workshop windows. The crowd erupted into cheers. People rushed forward to see it up close, to touch the plates, to ask questions. Some shouted praise, others simply stared in awe. The woman turned to the engineer. Her heart was full of gratitude. She remembered the long hours he had spent, the doubt he had faced, and the patience he had shown. Without him, the armor would still be broken, and she would still feel powerless. But the engineer did not raise his hands in victory, nor did he smile proudly at the crowd. He stood quietly, his eyes on the armor as if still checking for flaws. His calmness made the woman respect him even more. She stepped closer to him and spoke softly so that only he could hear. You believed in it even when I could not. You gave it back its strength. Thank you. He looked at her and replied simply. It was always strong. It only needed care to show its strength again. Those words touched her deeply. She realized he was speaking not only about the armor, but perhaps about her as well. The settlement celebrated that day. People talked excitedly about the armor's return, about how it would protect them again. They praised the engineer, though he continued to stay in the background, never seeking attention. For him, the greatest reward was not the cheers, but the sight of the woman standing tall, her courage restored. Later, when the crowd had gone and the workshop was quiet, the woman removed the armor and placed it gently back on its stand. She turned to the engineer and looked at him carefully. For the first time, she truly saw him not just as a worker or a quiet man who fixed things, but as someone who carried great strength within, a strength that came from patience, care, and belief. She felt a bond forming between them, though no words were spoken. It was the kind of bond that comes not from grand gestures, but from shared effort, from silent understanding, from trust built slowly over time. The armor had been tested and proven strong, but more importantly, the woman's faith in herself and in the quiet human engineer had been tested as well, and both had stood firm.